All right, if you would be making your way in your Bibles over to 2 Samuel chapter 18. I know typically we've been in the book of Revelation on Wednesday night, but I will be out of pocket not this Sunday, but next Sunday, and then the following Wednesday night. So I'm teaching the class. We're looking at 2 Samuel tonight in light of that. But again, we left off a week from Sunday, I believe, in verse 18, where, again, the big focus in this chapter is obviously Absalom's death. Absalom being the son of David. Absalom, who had obviously been upset with David, led a rebellion against him. Well, that rebellion has basically been thwarted by verse 18. Absalom has died. And as we saw in verse 17, all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. And there we talked about the reference of Israel was referring to all those that had supported Absalom, because in this sense, Absalom was already acting as the king. So Israel there was a reference to the loyal supporters of Absalom, which of course, right, Absalom's been killed. The rebellion's been put down. They basically return home. They don't pose a threat to David. But as we're going to see tonight, just because Absalom's dead does not necessarily mean that everything's all well and good for David. And specifically for David in terms of him being the king of Israel. As we'll see a little bit later on tonight, we're going to try to get down to chapter 19 and verse 8. The section we read here at the end of chapter 18 is pretty straightforward. But let's go ahead and begin with it. Looking at verse 19, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." All right, so we know that the direct orders for David, or from David, regarding Absalom were what? Yeah, I believe the specific phrase is deal gently, not hurt him. Whatever you do, do not kill Absalom. You are basically supposed to, defeat the army, but also capture him and bring him in. And we know, of course, that Joab ignored that order, right? Joab has him killed. The men that are with Joab, they also kill him, as we saw. Now, again, why would Joab do something like that? The text doesn't necessarily indicate. Some things we might want to keep in mind. This is something we hadn't gotten to yet, but we'll get to in 1 Kings chapter 1. When David is on his deathbed, there's actually for a brief moment sort of a contention between who's going to take over for David, right? Solomon, who we know would take over for David, but also David's other son Adonijah. And in that case, Joab sided with Adonijah. And it could have been that, Joab at this point liked Adonijah and saw Adonijah maybe as the better potential heir than potentially Absalom being redeemed and eventually becoming king the right way one day. That's a possibility. Certainly, of course, though, Joab had Absalom put to death either way. Now, when this happens, there's basically here Ahimaaz, who we have read about this individual before. Remember that he was the son of Zadok. Ahimaaz was one of the men that was responsible for relaying what was happening in the capital with Absalom and his men, relaying that information to David. And so naturally, this is a man that is used to running. It's a man that's in good shape. And so naturally, Ahimaaz has basically done this throughout the entire period where Absalom has rebelled, running to go and tell David news. And here Ahimaaz wants to go and talk to David, basically letting him know that the people that opposed you, well, now God has taken care of them. Which again, David had prayed for that. Certainly he relayed that to his men. This is what's happened. David's going to see this as a good thing, is sort of the idea of Ahimaaz. But now Joab, of course, who we know has directly disregarded the command of David, sort of comes to a recognition to a certain extent, recognizes, right, maybe this is not a good thing, at least at this point, right? Verse 20, Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." And whereas Joab recognized that he should not have killed Absalom, he does recognize that David, is not only going to be upset with Joab, but he's also going to be upset by the fact that Absalom's dead, right? And we'll see that in at the end of chapter 18 and into chapter 19. That's going to be a very big problem for David. So Joab, you can almost imagine Joab trying to calm down Ahimaaz. Again, Ahimaaz is a younger person. Joab trying to calm him down. Ahimaaz is really excited. He wants to go tell the news. But Joab reminds him again, you're not going to tell the king today because the king's son is dead. He's not going to be happy by this, right? Whereas you think you're happy, he's not going to be happy at all. Now, verse 21, though, instead of Ahimaaz going, Joab sends somebody else. Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. Now, there are a couple things that we want to note here. You almost think to yourself, Joab is the one who killed the king's son, or at least approved of it. Naturally, David's probably going to be upset, right, with Joab. And by the end of his life, David is upset with Joab, which we'll see when we get there. But Joab knows that he has directly defied the king's orders. And as a result of that, you would think that Joab, if he's the leader that he should be, would take responsibility for it, right? He's the one that gave the order to go kill Absalom. It should then be Joab's responsibility to say, look, we broke your rules, Absalom's dead. I think about this from the perspective of a leader, right? The ultimate leader, David's orders have been disobeyed. It should be the commanding officer right underneath him, that goes and reports that to the king and accepts the punishment for what has happened, right? That's typically what a leader does. And Joab here was the one that gave the order for Absalom to be killed. But instead of doing that, Joab kind of puts this off on this other man, right, to the Cushite. Now, here, the Cushite was probably a servant, more than likely a servant of Joab. He might have even been one of the individuals that were part of Joab's men that actually, thrust their spear through Absalom. But again, the Cushite would note to us here that this is not an Israelite. From what we understand, Cush was a region that was located somewhere south of Egypt, perhaps maybe modern-day Ethiopia. And so Joab doesn't feel like it's fit for him to deliver the news, nor does he feel like it's fit for Ahimaaz, the son of the priest, to deliver the news. But here is this non-Israelite who David probably doesn't know very well. Well, we'll let him go and tell the king what has just happened. Now, we have to keep in mind, how has David treated other messengers before that have delivered the news of other people's death? Most notably here, we think about Saul again, right? The servant that came up that bragged about killing Saul. Again, Saul being the enemy of David. Remember that David had that man killed. Well, if David has that type of response, Joab doesn't want to be put in that position. He doesn't want to put the son of the priest in this position, but this non-Israelite who's a servant, well, we don't have a problem putting him in this position. And I think there that, it kind of portrays Joab in a negative light. He's not going to take responsibility for breaking the king's orders, so he's not going to he's not going to face the immediate wrath of the king, but this Cushite who was underneath him, well, we'll let him take the brunt of punishment, perhaps. Either way, it's not a good look for Joab in this case. But now verse 22, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. Again, verse 22, so Joab said, why will you run, my son, since you have no news already? Verse 23, but whatever happens, he said, let me run. So he said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So Ahimaaz, even though he's been told by Joab, it's not good for you to go and deliver this news, you can almost, whether it's out of his past duty to David, whether it's out of just sheer excitement that the rebellion's put down, Ahimaaz wants to go and tell David what has happened. And his eagerness here is really what comes out in this passage. Again, think about what Joab's doing here. Again, he's telling Ahimaaz, you don't have to run all those miles to go and tell David what has happened, right? He's in a way, Ahimaaz doesn't have to work as hard, but he's willing to go and do it. But Joab's point is, again, why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready? And Joab's point is, if the Cushite goes and delivers the news about what's happened, there's no reason for you to go, right? Because the Cushite will tell David everything that's happened. But Ahimaaz, because he's so excited, again, let me run, let me go. And so he does, and here we note again that Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. And that'll be important in the verses that will follow. Now, where else in the Bible do we read about a man outrunning another man to get to a place? I believe so. I'm thinking the New Testament. You're probably right. I was thinking about the New Testament. Yeah, John outrunning Peter, right, to the tomb of Jesus. That was sort of another account that kind of reminded me of this situation. But again, Ahimaaz was a runner for David. He probably had a lot more experience, maybe in better shape. I don't know, but his occupation sort of lent itself to him being able to beat this individual to get back to David. Now, of course, David doesn't know anything that's happened. Verse 24, David, and this is where things are going to be tough for David, and I think they would be tough for anybody, because you're talking about here David's having to act as both king and he's also having to act as father in the same place. And the difference between focusing on what's happened as a father versus focusing on what's happened as the king is going to put David into a little bit of possibly hot water here, we could say. Nevertheless, David, especially like any father, is certainly concerned about what's happened. Hence, verse 24, David was sitting between the two gates. And typically cities at this time had an outer and an inner gate. A lot of times for security, but typically between the outer and the inner gate. In most cities, there was sort of like a court area. We might kind of think about this like a checkpoint when you first come into a city. But it's basically the first place that you stop at when you get into a city. And so the point is that, David's not sitting in a building. David's so eager that he's sitting right there at the very outskirts of the city wanting to hear what's happened and to see what the news is. So while David is sitting between the two gates, the watchman goes up. Again, verse 24, the watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and drew near. Now, This individual, of course, is Ahimaaz, that's being talked about in verses 24 and 25. Now note that the watchman notices that, and the text is very clear, that there was a man running alone. Now, we understand that to be the case because Ahimaaz is able to outrun the Cushite, right? So he gets there first. But there's also another emphasis here about this man running alone. And what it shows to the watchman, again, is that news is being brought. And as we'll see in a minute, David's going to note that it should be good news. But what David and the watchman are taking into consideration here, if there were a lot of men running back to the city, right, that means that they are probably fleeing from battle, which means that things did not go well for David and his men. However, there's only one individual, and eventually the second one, there's only one individual coming back, which means that the army has not fled, which would more than likely show that there's some type of good news coming to David and to his supporters, because you don't see the army fleeing back to the protection of the city. So the man comes and rapidly draws near. As he's getting closer, the watchman sees another man. Verse 26, the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So again, the king and the watchman recognizes this is not the retreat of David's army. This is a messenger coming to deliver some type of news to two individuals involved. All right, so verse 27, so the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Now, naturally, Ahimaaz had been doing this for a while. I don't know of anybody, that I could... Because the watchman here is able to know that when he sees the guy running, he knows that it's the same running style as Ahimaaz. There are probably some people that have a very, of course, I don't know how much y'all do a lot of running, but there probably are some people that do have a pretty defined running style where you can kind of tell them apart from other people. But this again goes back to the fact that Ahimaaz has constantly helped out David by running to David to deliver him news of what Absalom has done. The watchman probably was pretty familiar with Ahimaaz for that reason, which is why he knew the style of running that this man had. And the point being is that Ahimaaz had always, at least his job was to bring good news to David, or at least news that would support David, or in some way David would find helpful. That was what his job was when he was sort of working as a spy against Absalom. And so David naturally is recalling on that, and that's why he would make the statement about Ahimaaz that he is a good man and comes with good news. Because Ahimaaz has done this before, is the point. And David naturally is going to be pretty happy and pretty positive about it. I think that's also a good reminder as well. Typically we like people that deliver good news. Nobody likes to go to the doctor's office and hear that they ran some tests and they figured out that you have some type of sickness or disease that you didn't know about. That's a very serious condition. Nobody likes to hear that good news, or it likes to hear that type of news. But on the other hand, if you have tests run and you think that there's a potential problem there, the results of that test show that there's no disease or any type of serious illness going on, the doctor delivers that news and it's typically well received. You almost think about David in his mind trying to come to that conclusion that Ahimaaz is bringing to him good news. So, 28, Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Which in Ahimaaz's mind, everything's well because they've won. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." So not only did David recognize that, God was on his side, but David's men also recognized that this victory was accomplished by the hand of God. And again, would explain why they sided with David, right? You're not going to side against the man that is with God. It would not be fruitful for you at all. And so there's the recognition of that. Now notice verse 29. This is where you get into the problem for David. David trying to think like a father instead of maybe thinking like a king as he should have been. Verse 29, first thing out of David's mouth, the king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Is the young man Absalom safe? Now, any father here in this situation, this would probably be the first question you would ask, right? You know that your son's been in battle. If you've had children that have been in, served in the military, or if you've served in the military and you've tried to, if you served in the military in the past and you wrote back home, your parents and you as parents probably would have been very excited to hear about how your child is doing in the military, right? To hear that your child's doing well. That would be what's on your mind. For David, that's what's on his mind. Again, David thinking like a father. My son has been in battle even though it's against me, and my first consideration is I want to know if my son is okay. And that's his first question. Is the young man Absalom safe? But also in verse 29, Ahimaaz's response, Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, or verse 28, then verse 29, Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." All right, so we know that Ahimaaz knows what's happened. Obviously, again, if he wasn't there when Absalom was killed, Joab was specifically clear in verse 20 that Absalom was dead. So you would think here that the simple answer is the young man Absalom safe? No, he's dead. But Ahimaaz, again, knows that this is going to upset the king, which is why, instead of answering the question, kind of beats around the bushes, gives a very indirect answer. His answer is basically, while I'm being sent to deliver the news, there was a great tumult, and I don't know really what was going on. And the indication is perhaps Absalom was caught up in this. Whatever happened, I could not see because, there's a great tumult. There was a lot of people around Absalom. Perhaps, I don't know what it was about. So it would basically open the door for David to think, maybe Absalom's been captured. That's what the tumult was about. And again, Ahimaaz, rather than going and directly telling David the truth, he wants to be the one to deliver the good news, to maybe receive the praise from David, but he doesn't want to have to tell David the entire truth, which is why he tries to, plead ignorance here. I don't know what happened. But again, David doesn't really care. Verse 30, David doesn't say, "Good job, congratulate the army," doesn't do any of that. The king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And the reason why he does that is because he knows that there's another guy coming to deliver more news in his mind, right? The outcome of the battle really doesn't matter to David, as we're going to see a little bit in a moment. So Ahimaaz, get out of the way. Here comes this other guy. Maybe he knows what's happened to Absalom. Verse 31, just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who stood against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man." Now, unlike Ahimaaz, the Cushite here actually directly obeys what Joab said. He actually goes and tells David that Absalom is dead. Now, he doesn't come out and directly say that Absalom's dead. But the implication of verse 32, again the statement, may the enemies of my Lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. The implication there is that Absalom is dead. And so this is not the Cushite trying to get around it, right? The statement that he makes here is confirming that Absalom is dead, which again is the only thing that David's concerned about. But it does go to show here that the Cushite, at least the non-Israelite, is the one in this situation willing to tell the truth, whereas the son of the priest was not willing to do so. So, again, there are a lot of times religious, what does it mean to be pleasing to God? Some people think, again, if you're a religious person, you're automatically pleasing to God. Well, it's more than just, being religious or calling yourself religious. It's about what you do. And in this case, the Cushite, at least when it comes to the godly principle of honesty and telling the truth, he's more in line with that than the son of the priest. And again, that's something to point out here. Here's a non-Israelite doing what the law of Moses required, whereas the son of the priest, in this specific situation, would rather not give the full truth. In verse 33, and we'll stop at that point and make time for some comments. Verse 33, here's where the problem begins for David. Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. Now, this, I guess for us, at least if we think about it at first, this is not something that we would naturally be upset with David about, right? David's son has died. It's natural for a father to grieve for the death of his son. One of the teachers that I had in school, when I was down in Pensacola, made the comment, because his own son died, he made the comment that life's not designed for a father to have to bury his son. And his point was again how difficult it was for him having to bury his son and to move on from him. And I think naturally David has some of that similar reaction. David was not a perfect father at all, but again, he is deeply upset by the actions, or at least he is deeply upset, despite all the problems Absalom had caused him, he is deeply upset about Absalom being killed, so much so that he has to go in private, and that's the indication. He went up to the chamber of the gate. He tries to get away from people to kind of go into sorrow in private. And notice what he says there in that statement as he's going up, because there's a lot of significance here. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. Now again, a father might say that, right? A father who doesn't want to have to deal with burying his son, a father would probably say the same thing as David, right? I wish I could have traded places with my son so that I died and he lived. Well, that's David thinking as a father. But remember that David also is the king of Israel, right? He's responsible for all those men that went out to battle to defend David's honor and to try to at least help David regain control of the throne, right? While he's weeping about his son, he says, if only I had died in your place. Well, remember what was said earlier to David that we looked at last week, right? Remember that David wanted to go out into battle, but the men that were around David told him, don't go out into battle, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many of us die. All they want is to see you dead. And the men of David were basically reiterated to him, we're going to go and die on your behalf. You do not have to go out there and put yourself at risk. We're going to do that because we respect you as king, and we recognize that you are the only one that should be on the throne. But here's David. And certainly he is in a lot of grief. He's in a lot of sorrow. But in a way, it's a very unwise statement for David to say, only if I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. If only I had died in your place. Well, think about all the men that in the previous chapter just sacrificed their lives to make sure that David stayed alive. And yet, it doesn't matter about the sacrifice of those men at the end of the chapter. David just simply says, I would rather have died than you in the course of battle. O Absalom, my son, my son. And what's happening here is David is, naturally he's thinking like a father, but at the same time, he's not thinking like a king, right? All those men that were loyal supporters of him, something that Absalom was not, they went out and died on that battlefield for David, and basically with that statement said, I would rather have died. All those men sacrificed were for nothing because I'd rather have Absalom alive. And this is going to get David into some problems here in verse 19, or at least Joab, who is obviously not a perfect man, will talk some sense into David. With that being said, are there any comments on what we've talked about up to this point?
You have to wonder in the back of David's mind if he's not thinking indirectly, at least, he's responsible for this. Because, God said the sword will not depart from your house because of what you've done. So, it's genuinely sad to say that to reap consequences of what happened earlier. He didn't say, would God I had died for Uriah the Hittite.
Right.
He didn't say that. He's just self-absorbed right now, as any father would be.
And in the back of my mind, I kind of wonder if Joab knew that if they brought in Absalom alive, that David still wouldn't do the right thing, because he didn't do it the first time. But I mean, that's just a thought. Maybe another reason why Joab had Absalom killed is because he knew David wouldn't do it, which is what he should have done in the first place.
One thought I had was David was described as a man after God's own heart. Put David in the place of God, and we're his children. So we do wrong and we'll die.
Right.
Just like Absalom with David, but David was always forgiven for his sin.
Yeah, and David's in a really tough position. I don't know if y'all saw that on the news, because this account kind of does, sometimes as fathers, you have sons and they grow up and sometimes they do things that you don't like, and sometimes you try to overlook those faults. I don't know if y'all saw on the news, but the police were trying to arrest a son. Were trying to arrest this guy in Vermont. And the dad of that son got on an excavator and started to use the excavator to try to attack the cops to keep them from arresting his son. I don't know if y'all saw that on the news, but I think it was on there earlier this week. But that's the case of a father that, despite it, sort of overlooking his son's faults to try to defend, his honor. You can't do that.
Charles Manson was a mass murderer, but his mama said, he's still my son.
Right.
Still love him.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can still love your child in that situation, but there is you do have to recognize that your child does have to be punished in some way. I mean, I think that's one of the jobs of parents is to do that in the home with kids that are younger, so that way that when they get older, and perhaps crime gets a lot more serious and the punishment gets a lot more serious, you don't have to worry about your kids committing crime because you did the discipline at home like you should have as your child was growing up. All right, so verses 1 through 8 of chapter 19. Joab's going to have to talk some sense into David because David will not get over Absalom's death. All right, verse 1, Joab was told, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, "The king is grieved for his son." And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are shamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. So naturally the people are going to respond the way that the king does. Again, these are the people, you're not talking about Absalom's supporters here. You're talking about David's supporters here. Whereas they have just won a battle, their side has basically put down this inward civil war in Israel. They are not happy at all because the king is not happy. So instead of having a victory, perhaps a victory parade, everybody was mourning or was sad. Notice verse 3 that the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. And the indication there is that the people, instead of celebrating this like a great military victory, which, if you remember, some of you may remember, you've probably seen this in movies or photographs. You remember at the end of World War II, there were a lot of major parades in the cities throughout the United States because we had won both, we had ended the conflict in Europe and in the Pacific. And there were great victories in response of that. People wanted to celebrate that victory. But instead, the people, when they're coming back into the city, the people in the city and the men coming back from battle, they're acting as though they had just been defeated by Absalom and his men. They're acting as though they don't have any hope for any type of victory when, again, God had just delivered, as Ahimaaz said, God has just delivered the enemies of David into his hand, which should have been a time for rejoicing, but because David was thinking about this from the perspective of being just a father here, right, the people could not be happy as well. And certainly David probably should have had a little bit of remorse for Absalom, but at the same time, David has to recognize, justice in a sense has been carried out, right? Absalom, because he did rebel, he did have to be punished by the law. Again, that was a fault that David had at times. And that's a fault maybe sometimes parents have. I mean, I'm sure y'all have all heard, parents talk about, I love my child so much I can't discipline them. In whatever way they do that. Well, again, you don't really love your child if you don't discipline them in some way. Because, again, the whole process of disciplining them is to keep them from sort of, escalating and doing something even worse. Which, again, perhaps David should have done a better job of that as a father. Again, he is, even though he's a man after God's own heart, he is an imperfect man. So, verses 5 through 8, David and the people are upset. Joab's going to try to put an end to that. Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life." Something that we talked about, right? You're mourning for Absalom, and your mourning for Absalom is basically putting down the sacrifice of all those who protected you. You've disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters. No doubt David might have had other sons that fought in this battle. The lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, right? They're spared from destruction because of the sacrifice of these men, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well. You can imagine that statement right there hits pretty hard at David, because we know that to be the case. There's nothing wrong with loving your enemy, right? Jesus spoke about that. Matthew chapter 5, to love your enemy. But at the same time, you can't hate your friends in the same process. Sometimes we have to deal with people that are not good people. And you want to love your enemy. But when your enemy is hurting a close friend or a close relative of you, you're not going to put up with your enemy at that point, right? You love your enemy, but you don't love your enemy to the point where you allow your enemy to hurt the people that you care about. We've talked about that in the book of Revelation a lot, right? That's God's point in a lot of those places, Whereas it may be hard for us to understand, God's overall point is, right, you love your enemy, I'll love those that are hurting you, but it's not going to come at the expense of allowing them to keep hurting you, right? Because as we'll see in Revelation, right, the wicked are punished eventually at some point because of this point, right? You love your enemy, but not at the expense of hating your friends or those closest to you. And again, the point being, Absalom, if Absalom was alive and all of us were dead, David, you would rather have it that way, which is not the way that it should have been as king. So 7 and 8, therefore arise, go out and speak, comfort to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. And so the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told all the people, saying, there is the king sitting in the gate. So all the people came before the king, for every one of Israel had fled to his tent. And so, again, just the final point, Joab's very clear. David, if you don't go out and address the people in this victory, they're going to turn on you, is what he's saying. Then it's going to be a lot worse for you because you're not going to have any allies, right? If you allow them to turn on you because you're weeping about your son. And that's what we're going to pick up on Sunday, is David's going to address the people and basically kind of try to smooth things over for the people of Israel. With that being said, are there any final comments before we close this evening?
One of the Proverbs, I believe one of the Proverbs says, faithful are the wounds of a friend.
Right.
That's exactly what Joab is doing here.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes our friends have to tell us things that we don't like to hear, but it is for our benefit. And that is certainly the case with Joab reminding David, I get that you're sorrowing for your son. Think about all those who sacrificed for you to be the king, right? Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. All right, so we'll stop here tonight. We'll pick up in verse 9 on Sunday, but thank you for your time and thank you for your attention tonight.